Alrighty, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our fourth coronavirus response webinar. My name is Eric Rodell. I am our Business and Political Engagement Manager at People for Bikes. Today, we're going to be going over some Paycheck Protection Program stimulus, a brief couple of slides on tariff relief, and what's on the horizon for us at People for Bikes in the bike industry. Before we get started today, we always like to thank our members. Of course, without your support as coalition members of People for Bikes, we could not do our work at the federal level or at the state and local level, creating great infrastructure and making sure that biking can be better for everyone. Today we have three familiar faces from previous webinars. Charles Cooper, the Managing Director of the Signal Group, Noah Banian, our Federal Affairs Manager at People for Bikes, and Alex Logeman, our Policy Counsel at People for Bikes, to give us that trade and tariff update towards the end of the webinar. Our agenda today, just briefly, we'll be going over some of the new relief legislation that came out and federal policy updates, reviewing our resources and links that are all on our website at peopleforbikes.org, gives those brief updates on trade and tariffs, and then what's on the horizon for everyone in the bike industry here. So we'll jump right in, and I'll hand things over to Noah.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you can join us today. So as I'm sure you all know, and apologies, I'm just noticing this little typo on our TIM line. So Congress has been busier than many expected this time of the year before an election, obviously because of the spread of COVID-19 and needing to respond for economic relief and for healthcare expansion and funding of every stripe. So we'll walk through quickly what has already happened, because that helps us understand what we're looking at in the next few weeks to month from Congress, and also for what the bike industry needs. So back in the beginning of March, as coronavirus was clearly starting to spread across Asia and coming into the US, they passed an $8.3 billion funding bill as another really fast acting bipartisan measure to bring our healthcare systems up to speed. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be done from that point, but this was just the first of a few phases. So that was phase one back in the beginning of March, when the threat started to become really clear. Phase two, they needed a broad policy response. So not just injecting funding, but how are we going to use this funding, and what are the policies that will guide the disbursement as it goes into hospitals, as we start developing personal protective equipment, and schools needing some guidance as well was included in that as they transitioned into remote learning. Phase three, this was the really large $2.2 trillion pandemic relief response bill, the CARES Act, that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that we've talked about on these webinars and have many resources analyzing sections of the bill relevant to the bike industry. So the CARES Act was passed on March 27th. Most notably, for our sake, is the $349 billion program that was included within the Small Business Administration, the Paycheck Protection Program. And you all might also be aware that that $349 billion fund was depleted within 2 weeks. So there were other programs within the Small Business Administration, like economic injury, disaster loans and grants, that were also included, have since been diminished, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is the bill that really established the need for some small portions of stimulus as relief. We'll talk about the difference between relief and stimulus in a little bit, but this bill provided both. And I think this is the largest spending bill in history. And from there, we went into phase 3.5. This wasn't a full stimulus bill, this wasn't a full relief package, but it was just addressing some needs that came up really quickly after the CARES Act was passed. as I mentioned, the $349 billion fund for the Paycheck Protection Program was depleted within 2 weeks, with small businesses lined up, well, digitally lined up outside their lenders' offices and online to waiting on funding. This is, a really important program for small business owners in the bicycle industry. So we advocated strongly in DC for not only increased funding, but we need to continually have rounds to add funding to this program. So phase 3.5, which was passed just last week on April 24th, this added $310 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program and another $60 billion for economic injury, disaster loans, and grants. These are the two main programs that we'll reference throughout this webinar and throughout all of our resources because of the interest and demand that we've heard from the bike industry for these specific loans and grants and programs. So again, that was just 3.5. Which means we're looking ahead still for 4, for 5. When we actually start looking to stimulus, it'll be that'll be all on the table. We also want to walk through a few of the resources, and again, these are just a few of the resources that are available. I'm sure you are all your inboxes are hopefully inundated with different resources if you're a business owner that you can take advantage of that are available to you right now. So we always want to direct you back to our website. We have a running list guide source of industry resources. All of these will be links that you'll have access to when we share these slides after the webinar. So that's a fluid page. We keep updating it as things change in DC at the state level, at local levels, and we think it's pretty comprehensive resources for folks in the bike industry. The Department of Treasury also has really helpful guidance for the programs that you might be interested in. Same with the Small Business Administration. We work with Signal Group in Washington, D.C. You'll hear from Charles shortly. They have been providing fantastic analysis and content related to these new federal programs that are popping up throughout these different relief bills. And they're providing a daily newsletter with updates happening federally, state level, and globally in response to the pandemic. So that's another great resource. And another fantastic organization doing really important work for small businesses, big businesses, all sizes, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we highly recommend their resource page for, they've done a really great job with some graphics that help break down the disbursement of these loans and programs and sort of the hierarchy, the structures of these resources. With that, I will kick it over to my colleague Charles at the Signal Group.
Great, thank you so much, Noah, and thanks to People for Bikes for all that they're doing, and everybody who's on the phone for joining us today. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about where we see the difference in relief and stimulus, since both of those terms are being used throughout the press and reports. As Noah pointed out, we've gone through basically 3.5 relief packages. For the most part, these have really responded to on-the-ground immediate needs of hospitals, local governments, workers, and businesses. And I think, as well as federal agencies, I should add. And I think each one of those bills basically was more of a funding source and creating programs to help one of those entities. At some point, as the relief effort reduces and everyone starts looking at what longer term policy could be, I think Congress is going to start looking more into stimulus or economic recovery legislation. And we're sort of somewhat in the middle of both of those. There's still some relief efforts that are going to be needed and probably needed for a long period of time. But there's also folks starting to look at the potential for stimulus or broader economic recovery provisions. And for the issues that we're looking at, obviously, we look at a lot of the relief efforts because of programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, but we're also looking at sort of broader economic recovery, because that's where some of the infrastructure issues may arise, as well as some of the tax relief to businesses that work within the bike industry. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about where we see this going from here on the next slide. There's a lot on the table right now, and I think it would be unfair of anybody to fully say that they knew what was going to happen moving forward. But generally speaking, this next package, which we think will be sometime in May, is probably geared more towards what we're calling CARES 2.0. The broader legislation that produced these grant programs and the loans and loan forgiveness is the CARES Act, as Noah referenced. And a lot of those programs will probably need some additional funding. And they also may need some slight adjustments here and there in order to move forward with relief. So we believe a number of the things that are on the table are expansion of paid leave programs and worker protections. Those were passed very early on in this process. State governments and local governments are aggressively requesting more funding. Local governments receive some additional funding in a couple of these packages. State governments have asked for $500 billion more. Potentially another round of direct payments to individuals. Obviously, there's some healthcare issues within that realm of possible provisions. They also may be looking at the scope of some of these programs and expanding it or adjusting it based on new needs that they're seeing on the ground. One of those, the most popular one, seems to be the Paycheck Protection Program. As Noah mentioned, that's fairly oversubscribed. So they'll probably, I would assume, be looking at potentially putting some additional funds in that. But there's also a number of entities that were not included in that latest round that they may be looking to expand the scope there. And then various workforce policies, as well as some provisions that would add additional money to other programs that maybe haven't been leveraged yet. Let's go to the next slide. But there's a lot more on the table of sort of what policymakers are looking at. The timing of it is not yet known. So this could be all put together in one package. This could be spread out over a number of packages. But as policymakers are starting to look at that second portion that I mentioned, which is stimulus or economic recovery, there's a whole new list of items that are technically on the table. One is transportation and infrastructure, which for obvious reasons, People for Bikes is doing a lot of work on to make sure that if there is economic recovery legislation, that there's robust funding for bicycle infrastructure. The other is climate. There was a lot of climate-related funding in transportation bills that have been considered in the Senate so far. As we look at what happens in phase 4, we can assume that some of the things that don't make it into that package would also be included in later packages. Under the infrastructure banner, clean water, broadband, telecom, tax relief are all certainly on the table. I think they're also looking at potentially increasing funds for hospitals and community health centers. We talked a little bit about local government. There may be some specific relief for industries. To this point, with very few exceptions, they've tried to create very large buckets that a diverse group of industries can all participate in and not pick winners and losers. As we get closer to the economic recovery phase, there may be some programs that are more specific to industries. There could also be project-based funding. For those of you that recall the 2009 stimulus bill, they often referred to shovel-ready projects. These were projects based on mostly existing pots of money and a couple new programs, but that's also possible when they get to economic recovery. A couple other issues: election reform based on remote voting, some payroll tax issues, as well as what Senate Democrats have called the HEROES Fund. This is essentially hazard pay for essential employees. So those are sort of everything that's on the table. From our perspective, it seems like what Congress will prioritize in the next phase will be specifically around the programs that were in CARES Act and what's needed on the ground immediately. And there certainly will be needs in the very short term on that front. If House, which will be starting the debate most likely, if they believe that they can add some of the economic recovery provisions in there, that would be a vehicle to do it. And then the Senate would have to determine how they proceed. But at this point, I know everyone's prioritizing the more near-term issues and hoping to get to some of the longer-term issues. It's not totally clear yet what happens. We're obviously preparing for both. For the issues that are probably most at the top of the list for folks on this call, especially the Paycheck Protection Program, there will be a process where policymakers are closely monitoring where those programs are moving in terms of how much funding is left, and obviously the funding in the PPP will probably be subscribed pretty quickly here. And I think that as they look at those and determine what to do next, increasing funding opportunities for those programs are certainly initiatives that some policymakers will want to do. It's tough to say now. They haven't drafted a bill, of course, but they're certainly not going to allow small businesses, hospitals, workers, and first responders within cities and states. They're certainly not going to stop the relief effort, even when economic recovery moves forward. So I would expect that to be the driving force between the next round, again, sometime in May, probably mid to late May, and with a possibility that they may be adding some of the larger pieces that we discussed around infrastructure and tax and otherwise going forward. So with that, I will hand it off to Alex to talk a little bit about the current state of trade and tariffs.
Thank you, Charles. And just so everyone knows, we'll be running a dedicated webinar to trade and tariff issues next month, where we can do a deeper dive on some of these. So I'll cover the highlights of what's been going on recently in our update here. And the first thing I want to mention is some new product exclusions that were granted last week. Critically, these include about all multi-speed bikes that are imported under this, I'll call it the road bike tariff schedule heading, but essentially it includes lighter bikes with narrower tire widths, and that's 8712002500 that you can see there. That was granted last Wednesday. And then also an exclusion for wheel rims was granted last Wednesday. We're projecting these two exclusions will save the industry about $25 million in tariffs that can be recovered, that have already been paid or avoided in the future going up through the expiration dates. And as you can see on the next bullet point, the expiration dates for several of our exclusions are coming up pretty quickly here. Each of the different lists has a different product exclusion date. USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, has kind of altered how they issue these exclusions as time has gone on. But you can see for us, everything's going to happen in August and September of 2020. And so what will happen as we get closer to these dates is that the U.S. Trade Representative will open up another public comment process to make decisions on which product exclusions should be extended for another year. It's been very difficult so far to get product exclusions extended. Obviously, we'll be advocating for that very aggressively, but the Trade Representative's office has really tightened the products that have been subject to an exclusion as it's gone through this process, at least as far as list 1 items are concerned. So I just want everyone to be aware of these dates because these are the last dates that at this point you can rely on these exclusions to be effective. Finally, there are also pending exclusions that the U.S. Trade Representative has not ruled on. For list 3, you can see some here. There are some noteworthy ones for frames, forks, and frame parts. And then for list 4, there are quite a few. I've just grabbed a few here of the more noteworthy ones, but there's quite a bit on that list. Rear lights, helmets, shoes, locks, apparel, lots of other things there. What you really need to know about this is that you should be conscientious about making sure you preserve your right to a refund. If you think about these list 3 items, the tariffs went into effect on those goods in September of 2018. So you may have shipments that are now a year and a half old that an exclusion has still not been ruled on yet. And Customs and Border Protection has released guidance that you can you'll be able to click to when Eric sends out these slides after, that tells you how you can preserve your right to get that refund. Because what you'll normally do to get that refund is file a post-summary correction on your entry if it's unliquidated, or if your entry's been liquidated, you would file a protest. You only have 180 days after your entries are liquidated to file that protest, and your entries normally get liquidated in 314 days. So you can see how in just under a year and a half, your sort of administrative deadlines would expire to recoup these tariffs. But essentially what Customs and Border Protection has advised importers is that you can either keep your entries in unliquidated status if there's a relevant pending product exclusion that you're waiting on a ruling for, or alternatively, you can essentially preemptively file a customs protest noting that it's based on a pending exclusion, and Customs will not rule on that protest until the U.S. Trade Representative actually rules on the underlying exclusion. So those are the two of the mechanisms you can use to preserve your right to a refund, even if you have a really old shipment and some of these deadlines are approaching, but there's a relevant product exclusion that you're waiting on. So make sure you review that guidance, and obviously how this applies to individual scenarios is going to depend on where they are in that process, what the goods are, but speak with your legal counsel and customs broker about making sure you follow the procedural steps that you need to get that refund in case one of these exclusion requests is successful, as USTR cleans out the backlog of requests it has to deal with. Also, make sure to visit our exclusion webpage if you have any questions. There's a list of every exclusion that has been granted. There's links to all the resources I've covered here and much, much more. So if you have questions about the exclusion process, you can probably find the answer there. The other piece of big news that came out in the last couple of weeks was Customs and Border Protection announced how it would be implementing a deferral of tariff deposits. This was the result of an executive order signed by President Trump. And essentially what it will do is it will allow some importers to delay their duty deposit payments on entries from March and April by 90 days. There's a couple key sort of caveats to this. One is that it will not apply to any entries that contain merchandise that is subject to heightened tariffs, including Section 301. It includes more than Section 301. If the product was subject to anti-dumping duties or a Section 232 tariff or anything that is sort of a heightened tariff measure, that merchandise is ineligible. And if you have that merchandise in your entry, your whole entry will be ineligible. So if you have some merchandise in your entry that might be eligible for a deferral and some that's not, you'll have to separate those into separate entries, which Customs has said you can do. Also, you need to be suffering from significant financial hardship, and Customs has defined this to mean that you've been partially or fully suspended from your operations due to one of these government orders that has been issued by either a state or local government to limit business operations. And then your receipts from either March or April of 2020 need to be less than 60% from the same period in 2019. So if those two things apply to you and you have merchandise that might be eligible, you may have the opportunity to defer some of your tariff payments by up to 90 days. And again, there's guidance from Customs and Border Protection that we've linked to here in our slides where you can get more information on that. And that's it for our quick tariff update. So Eric, I think I'll kick it back to you first.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And Noah, I will just have you wrap things up for us here on this last slide for everyone.
Great, thanks everyone. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so we'll keep this brief. Charles mentioned policy-wise what we're looking ahead at, what's on the table for future phases of relief and then stimulus. And of course, transportation infrastructure is a huge priority of People for Bikes, and we're working on that heavily here in DC. We know that more people are biking right now than they may have been a few months ago. People are looking for local ways to stay active, to not travel far, but get in a workout, to bring the bikes out of the garage, or find a way to get the whole family active. We are seeing this on our trails and our streets. We're just seeing so many more people, maybe than normal, maybe because they're not working, however it is. And we want people to keep biking, but obviously for a different reason. We don't want the pandemic to be the reason that people are biking. But if there's any silver linings to be found right now, it should be that we're working to make sure that the policies coming out right now are not only fixing and helping the situation at hand, but preparing us for a world where biking is more the norm, it's more accessible, it's safer, it just makes every bike ride better. Ultimately, that's our mission. So we just want to make sure that you all know that. And if there's any ways, ideas, resources, thoughts that you have on how to get there, let us know. We are all ears. I'm going to leave it at that so we can get to some questions.
All right, thank you, Noah, Charles, and Alex, and for all of our attendees here. If you do have any questions for our presenters, please type those into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll wait for a couple of those to come in. I know that was a lot of information, so I do want to let you all know that we will be sending out this slide deck with the links to all of those resources and the CPB resources that Alex listed out during the 301 update, as well as we'll be including that link to register for the Trade and Tariff webinar on May 20th in the follow-up email that I will send out later. And it looks like you have a question for us. You raised your hand in the control panel, but can you type your question into that box if you have one? Well, not seeing any questions show up here, and we will go ahead and follow up with you directly. We want to thank all of you for joining us again today for our coronavirus update webinar, and we'll be sure to get these resources to you as quickly as possible. Thank you all again for joining, and we will get back with you soon.